task force. And I just wanted to say I'm very proud to introduce my big brother, William Rogers. He's to speak to us. He's a professional community leader in the Bay Area, and he'll talk to us about his experiences living with the intersectional identity of being both Black and gay as a person and as a father. So welcome, William.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I'll introduce myself by saying I'm a cisgender man who's Black, who's gay, who's a father, and I'm also the CEO of a large nonprofit organization in Northern California. Born in Los Angeles. My family of origin is multiracial. My father is Black, my mother is white. I have an older white sister from my mother's first marriage. And then I'm one of 3 children born from the union of my parents. We always consider ourselves a Black family. We were raised in a middle-class Black neighborhood near South Central LA. And I've lived most of my conscious life at the intersection of race and sexual orientation. So I wanted to start by saying that there is definitively racism in the gay community or the LGBT community, and there's homophobia in the Black community. And I think that there are basic human needs that are not afforded to everyone equally in American culture. And the 2 of those are safety and belonging. So I think that often people of color don't feel safe and are made to feel that we don't belong. I think LGBTQ people often don't feel safe and we're made to feel that we don't belong. And if you live at the intersection of being Black and LGBTQ, the lack of safety and belonging is just compounded. So I'm going to talk a little bit, not so much the theory of intersectionality, because I think that everybody sort of knows what that is. But I do think, well, one thing I want to say about intersectionality is that it's often described as sort of a disadvantage by multiple sources of oppression, whether it's race, class, identity, sexual orientation. But I also think that it's the opposite as well. That intersectionality can be an advantage, depending if you're, for example, white, male, and straight, that has traditionally been an advantage, whereas other intersections have not been. So I'm gonna really focus my time on talking about personal experiences today. And mostly what I'm hoping to do is engage with you in a conversation about this topic and about intersectionality. So I'm going to start with race, and I learned about race from a really early age. We talked about race in our family. My parents had the talk with me about being Black in America very early on. The lessons I learned about race were initially outside of the family. I mean, there were silly things like in 3rd grade, there was a kid named Denzel, not the Denzel, but a Denzel. Was learning about his colors and announced that white and Black makes gray. And so he spent the rest of the school year calling me gray. I remember when I was 8 years old, and this is a more sort of serious thing, I had a huge afro, and my mom decided that she was gonna take us to Laguna Beach for Christmas. And my dad refused to go because he didn't like Laguna Beach, which was really a way of saying it wasn't diverse enough and he didn't feel comfortable. So on Christmas Day, there was a place that my mom liked to stay, and we played in the pool and we played with our toys, and it was awesome. And then on Christmas night, the only place that was open was Denny's. And so we decided to have dinner there. And my mom and my 3 sisters, we were sitting in a booth, and there was an aisle, and then there was a long counter where people could also sit. And so I was sitting directly across the counter at the edge of the booth. And a man in the leather jacket sat across the aisle from me. And I started to hear something, and I couldn't quite understand it, but it felt threatening to me. And I listened more closely, and he was saying under his breath, "Nigger, nigger." And I distinctly remember how he said it with a level of disgust and contempt. And he said it several more times. And finally I turned to my mom and I whispered, "Mom, I think this man is calling us niggers." And she didn't believe me. She goes, honey, I think you may be mishearing it, whatever. And so I said, well, then you sit on the outside of the booth.
Oh, God.
Wow. She was like, okay. So we switched. And at that moment, I think it was the first time that I realized that my mother had lost her white privilege. She became very upset. She found the manager and let the manager know what was going on. And the manager was really well-meaning, but was really perplexed. And I don't know if it was because my mother was white, but he didn't seem to understand like what the problem was. So my mother became really heated and she started to cry with anger. And all of us were terrified as kids. The manager finally agreed to speak to the guy in the leather jacket. And we'd heard about people like this, and we'd heard that people had been harmed or killed by people like this. And so we wound up leaving the restaurant. The manager said, you don't have to pay for dinner, and we left, and we went back to the hotel. And still we're just consumed with immense fear. And I remember, it's actually, I have still the body memory of that moment and the fear that I felt. So all of us kids voted that we wanted to go home. And we were afraid that he was going to come and kill us in the middle of the night. And so my mother packed up everything and we drove back to LA. Christmas had sort of been ruined for us. I remember looking back as we were driving back to LA and making sure that the guy with the leather jacket on the motorcycle wasn't following us. And it was one of the first times I remember feeling unsafe around race and that I didn't belong because of race. And then I learned at 10 years old that racism happens within families. My mother's parents, my white grandparents, would take my older sister on trips. And I should say that my older sister is from my mother's first marriage, so she is white. They would take her on trips. She had been to their home in Oregon several times, and the rest of us had not. And I remember asking myself one day, why did Grandpa and Grandma take Jennifer places and don't take us places? And so I was like, well, we both have nice smiles. We're both smart. Well, we have different dads, but that shouldn't matter. And then it hit me that the difference between our fathers was that our father was Black and her father was white. So I marched downstairs and I demanded an answer from my mother. And I said, Mom, are Grandpa and Grandma racist? And she said, honey, it's complicated. And I persisted and I said, are Grandma and Grandpa racist? And she finally said yes. And so I called a conference with my siblings to let them know what I had learned and to talk about it. To make matters worse, I later learned that my grandparents had offered my father money not to marry my mother. Oh. They believed that all Black people were drug addicts. And so that was another rude awakening for me around, again, not feeling safe even in my own family and not feeling like I belonged in my extended family because of race. And I remember very adamantly wishing and hoping that racism would be gone by the time I was an adult. Mm-hmm. So I became aware of sexual orientation at an early age as well. So when I was 5, I remember having this crazy dream of being in a bed full of naked people, but everybody had beards and had hair. And so I was like, oh God, they must have been men, right? So that was sort of like my first inkling that something was a little different. And then at 7, I remember I touched my swim coach's arm and I brushed against the hair on his arm. And I felt this tingling sensation. And that was my second clue that I might be gay. And by the time I was 12, it was clear to me that I was gay. And I remember I got lots of messages about that in both the Black community and at home. And I remember one day I was in the living room with my dad and we were reading the paper. I was reading the LA Times and there was an article about whether gay people should get the benefits from their partner's employers, right? If they were partnered, should they be eligible for their partner's benefits? And I said to my dad, I said, well, what do you think about that? And my dad looked at me and he goes, gay people shouldn't have any rights. And so I knew at that moment that not unlike my grandparents and racism, that I also didn't belong or couldn't belong because of my sexual orientation. Living in the Black community, there was no room for homosexuality. There was a really narrow definition of what it meant to be Black and male. There was this real push to fit into the larger culture, to be sort of beyond reproach. Sports, religion, masculinity played a huge role in defining what it was to be male. And, you know, fundamentally, Black men had been castrated sort of throughout history, socially castrated, I should say. Actually, there was also physical castration, but socially castrated throughout history, through slavery, through not being considered a full human being. And being gay was just yet another knock to manhood. So we tried to be as normal as possible so we could fit into the larger culture. And I heard the words faggot all the time. And I didn't want those words to be spoken about me. So I dated girls and I tried to appear as heterosexual as I possibly could for as long as I could. I struggled as a teenager like many LGBTQ teenagers do. And I suicidal ideation, very depressed. And so when I was 16, my father sent me to a psychologist. And it was a friend of his who was a psychologist, unfortunately. And as I expressed to him that I was struggling with my sexual orientation, he decided to let my father know what we were talking about. And so they hatched a plan to send me to a sex surrogate. And the sex surrogate I remember her name was Vina Blanchard. She was 27 years old. I was 16. And I was told by the psychologist that I could not possibly be gay because I hadn't had sex with a woman yet. So the goal was for my 16-year-old self to have sex with this 27-year-old woman. And then I would learn that I wasn't gay. And so we got to the point of being naked together, my learning a lot about female anatomy, and then we made out in the nude. And fundamentally, we never had sex because I wound up leaving home. So at 16, I just finished 10th grade, and it was clear to me that my spirit, I could stay and my spirit would be crushed, or I could leave and give my spirit a chance. So I knew I was gay. I also knew that my father and the community would never accept it. So I decided to leave with my spirit intact and try to be who I am. So I left home. I was on the street for months. I was afraid I was going to be killed at night, so I wouldn't sleep at night. I would walk around a nicer neighborhood or hang out in a nicer neighborhood at night, and then I would sleep in a park during the day. Every few days, I would call the runaway shelter to find out if they had any room, and they would often say, "Oh, there's a church that has a bed for you for the night, or a church that has a shower for you." And eventually, several months later, I got into the runaway shelter. And of course, because I was a minor, they had to call my parents. And remember when my father and mother showed up, my mother was distraught because she hadn't known where I was. And my father, he looked at me and he said, "How dare you? Do you know how many people I know in this community?" And when I refused to go home with them and decided to stay, he said to me, "You know what? You will never amount to anything." So I remember looking at him and thinking quietly to myself, we'll see. So I struggled for a bunch of years. Between 16 and 20, I started a community college, 4 times, dropped out all 4 times for various reasons. And then finally the 5th time something clicked, and I don't know why, but it clicked, and I got my first semester at Santa Monica Community College. I had 4 A's and a B. And then I started a club called the UC Club, for people who wanted to transfer to UC campuses. And then I ran for student body president and won. And I was the president of student body the following year for 22,000. And I transferred to UC Berkeley with a 3.9 GPA. And I was on my way, and I was thinking, maybe I am gonna amount to something after all. At that point, my father was kind of like, you're surprising me. I'm surprised that this is happening. So it was, that was really good. And when I got to Berkeley, I was 23. At 24, I officially came out. The irony of all this is that my father's brother was gay. And my Uncle Morton lived in New York. He was very successful. Everyone talked about my Uncle Morton as a bachelor. They said he had a roommate because New York was expensive. But as a Black family, his sexual orientation was never acknowledged. And it wasn't acknowledged until 1988 when he told the family that he had AIDS. By that time, I was out of a closet. I went to visit him. He died in 1989. 2 years later, my cousin Chet, another Black family member who was also closeted, died of AIDS. And I remember thinking at the moment how sad it was that I didn't have the opportunity to share my sexual orientation and what it was like to be a Black gay man with these two members of my family, and how lonely and isolating that must have been for them, and it was for me to not be able to do that. So I started to feel the intersection between race and sexual orientation when I was in my early 20s. I wanted to meet someone, so I started looking at personal ads and wanted to figure out, want to meet somebody. And what I found was really disappointing. I naively thought that everyone who was gay would embrace others that were gay regardless of race. And I didn't imagine racism existed in the gay community. I was wrong. Many of the personal ads would say gay white male seeking gay white male looking for same. And then there was this horrible tagline that would end some of the ads, and it would say, no fats, femmes, or Blacks. I remember answering personal ads and talking to people over the phone. And before a meeting, they'd always ask me what my nationality was. And I would say, American. And then, of course, I know that's not what they meant, but that's what I would say. And they would say, no, what's your ethnicity? And so I tell them. And I remember a guy saying, I don't really like running my hands through a Black guy's hair. Had another man tell me, I don't like the way Black men smell when they sweat. And then there's the inverse, right? The notion that Black men were a commodity with a monster endowment and were sexually aggressive and would fulfill some sort of fantasy. So there was really no room to just be me, to just be the human being that I was and that I am. And Black gay man was just another category to either be exploited or avoided in the community. So I was already a Black man who was facing racism. And I was a gay man. I was a Black man, actually, sorry, a Black man who was facing racism, and a gay man facing homophobia in this world. And frankly, it was just exhausting. So if I fast forward to, I started a family. I was in a relationship for almost 25 years with my now ex-husband. I met him in my late 20s, and we decided to have children. And we adopted 2 boys from foster care. My then husband was white, and we adopted 2 African-American boys. And we went through Catholic Charities because we followed our social worker there. She got a job at Catholic Charities. And Catholic Charities didn't want to allow a gay male couple to adopt. So our social worker told them that they had to because they received money from the city of San Francisco and they couldn't discriminate. And so all the forms had to be changed from mother and father to parent 1 and parent 2, sort of all the subtle ways that people are excluded. And I remember walking into a training room where all the potential adoptive parents were meeting, and everyone was white and straight. No one was happy that we were there. And they made it clear, very clear, that we did not belong. So in adoption, particularly in public adoptions, there are books you can look through of children that are available for adoption. And what was clear is there were a lot of Black boys in those books. And I wanted to adopt Black boys. So it was odd to me because every time we were interested in a child, the social worker would basically rip those children out of the book and give us the pages. And I'm like, well, wait, doesn't somebody else need to see these kids? Why would you rip these out? Why wouldn't you just photocopy them? And she said, there are over 300 families at Catholic Charities in San Francisco who wanted to adopt children. And there was not one other family that wanted or was willing to adopt Black boys. So she would just rip out the pages and hand them to us. As it turns out, we were the first and the last gay male couple to adopt through Catholic Charities in San Francisco, because after that, they closed their adoption service because they didn't want the struggle of having to allow gay and lesbian people to adopt with a diocese that did not believe in that. So once we adopted, we had our 2 boys, loved our 2 boys. We adopted my oldest son at 10 months and his younger brother at 2 weeks old. They are now 18 and 21, so been a parent for quite a while now. The trips to the grocery store when they were little were a complete minefield. I mean, we were constantly asked, like, one of my kid would be crying and I'd be like soothing and rubbing his back and it's going to be okay. And I every single time somebody would walk in and say, "Where's his mother?" So there was this oddness about, like, men couldn't be nurturing. We couldn't raise a kid. Like it was fascinating, actually. And then, they would say, like, "Was your child adopted?" And yes. And it's like, "Well, did you get him from Africa?" No. He came from America, actually. When people found out we had adopted through foster care, one woman said to me, I was standing in line at the grocery store and she was like, "On behalf of humanity, thank you for what you're doing." And I'm like, really? That is not why I did this. To further humanity, I did this because I wanted a family. I knew that there were children who needed to be adopted, and it was a way for us to create a loving family. Others would say, well, they must be crack babies if they came from the foster care system. And these are all in the supermarket, right? And then people would say things like, "Those boys are so lucky that you adopted them." And my standard response was actually, no, I'm the lucky one. People could not wrap their head around 2 gay men raising kids and the multiracial nature of our family. I had Black folks who expressed their disgust that 2 gay men were raising Black boys because that would do something to affect their masculinity and their sexual orientation. And I really got sick of explaining myself because I didn't fit into concepts of what was normal. And I wound up stealing myself every time I was out in public. And then there were the people who craved diversity. So there's the opposite of that, right? So in preschools, when admissions folks would ask about our family, and they'd find out that we were an interracial gay couple with 2 adopted Black boys, one admissions person said, "Oh my God, that is a lot of diversity in one package." And I was like, "Did you really say that?" So we got into every single preschool that we wanted to. And what we decided is that we declined most because we didn't want to have our family be the one to diversify the school. We wanted our kids to go to a place where they were not the only one, because nobody wants to be the only one of anything. So once in school, fascinating, a lot of the little kids, I remember in preschool, I came into my son's preschool and I got cornered by 4 little kids. They were probably, they were 4, right? And they're like, how come Zachary doesn't have a mom? And I'm like, well, Zachary's very lucky. He has 2 dads. And they were like, "Oh, well, I want 2 dads." And they kind of scurried away, right? And then they came back and a couple weeks later and they said, "Well, if Zachary doesn't have a mom, then how was he born?" And then I explained that, he had a birth mother and et cetera. But what's fascinating is the parents in the school, they were all freaked out because they didn't know how to explain same-sex adoption to their children. And I was like, it's the same as straight adoption. I mean, you have an individual who is not the biological parent who adopts a child. And so we wound up having to write a letter to the entire school explaining to them how they could talk to their children about same-sex adoption. So the sort of the burden that is placed on one to explain and to educate all the time is also exhausting. I know that my youngest son, who had mostly Black friends who were largely, and there's a lot of, again, homophobia in the Black community. He often wouldn't bring his friends home because he didn't want to be pulled out of his peer group and have it be known that his dads were gay. So today, my challenges are a little different. My ex-husband and I divorced about 2 years ago. And my sons are now, as I said, 18 and 21. My 21-year-old is sort of a caramel brown. My 18-year-old is a chocolate brown. But I have different worries now. My older son has been pulled over 14 times while driving. Never has gotten a ticket in our progressive Northern California. My sons have been stopped by the police in front of my house and questions about what they're doing there, even though we live in a relatively multiracial neighborhood. It's gotten less multiracial as time has gone on, but when we moved here, it was a third Black, a third white, a third Asian. My younger son was just pulled over last week and handcuffed as the police searched for weapons and drugs. He had neither. And so he and his friends sat around the corner while they ripped apart his car, and they found nothing, and then they just let them go. And it's always a, sorry about that. Ironically, and I think this is hilarious, my younger son, who is darker skinned, says that one of the ways he gets cops to treat him better is to tell him that his dads are gay. So, and he says he fits it in whenever he can. So and what he says is, he goes, well, you know, my gay dads are going to be really upset that, you know, I've been pulled over. And he says every time he can see them shift, he's no longer sort of a thug in their eyes. It throws them off a little bit. It's unexpected. They start to see him differently, and they treat him differently with a little bit more respect. And it's an interesting way, it's another interesting way that race and sexual orientation intersect, right? That he's able to do that. And I mean, who knew that gay dads would benefit Black boys who are pulled over for being Black while driving? It's just, I find that hilarious. You know, we chose to stay in the Bay Area because it had a large Black population, because the Bay Area is gay friendly. We didn't feel like it was safe to live anywhere else, but the truth is, all of these things happen in the Bay Area too. We cloud it with this notion of progressivism, and people are saying the right things, but fundamentally, all of those things, all of those isms and still exist. And so I would just end by saying I am encouraged by the conversations resulting from George Floyd's death. I am cynical as well, because I think that we have a lot of work to do, and people have to be willing to do the work. And I think the work is going to get harder. But I actually hope that the conversations that are starting now will continue and will get deeper, because I think it's so important. Empathy is really important, and understanding other people's realities is critical, so that we don't inadvertently perpetuate oppression. We don't inadvertently perpetuate microaggressions or macroaggressions that cause people to feel unsafe and that they don't belong. So with that, I would love to have a conversation. I'd love to hear from some of you about some of what's happening in the church and some of the work that you guys are doing, and to answer any questions that you might have. Leslie, you're muted.
If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself.
Got it. Okay. So, William, it's interesting. I hadn't heard that story about, oh, I guess this has happened with Kenyon, your youngest son, being pulled over, and the fact that he says, I have gay dads, and you know what makes me, and that gives him better treatment. And I guess what I find really interesting about that is, if you kind of dissect that down and kind of get to the root of what that is, it's basically saying this perception that gay men are less like sort of hyper masculine and less brute force, you know, and so therefore, you know, he's less of a threat.
Right.
Kenyon is less of a threat.
Exactly.
Less, considered supposedly less masculine or whatever, or less brutal. Right. And that's really scary. Go ahead.
No, I think it's a really good point. And what it does is it modifies the fear of
Right.
the aggressive black male, and it's modified by by sexual orientation, by gayness, right? And so that tamps down the fear and the intensity of hypermasculinity and fear. So it's fascinating. I find it I love it because I mean, it's awful, right?
Yes, yes.
But it's hilarious at the same time because, as I said, who would have thought that you could use sexual orientation to, make things better with cops when you're pulled over because you're a young black man.
And you know what? Maybe Kenyon can send that out to the grapevine to other black men.
Maybe that'll be all of a sudden all these black men who have gay dads. Every time they get pulled over.
William,
I had no idea that there were so many black men with gay dads.
William, I have a question for you. I heard your share about your relationship with your father, and I can imagine how painful that must have been. And I wanted to know, is your father still alive, or did he pass? And how did you cope? And how did that shape you into who you are? And how did you deal with that? Because I imagine that there has to be some degree of coming to terms, maybe forgiveness or something. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. No, absolutely. It's a good question. So my father's passed. He passed in 1997. He died of cancer. I was, it was complicated, right? Because my father had a rough childhood, and he grew up in Texas. They were poor, but considered middle class because they had education. And for black families, when you were educated, you were considered middle class, even if you didn't have money. But he was involved in all sorts of crazy stuff, and he was in the Korean War. And so he had a level of anxiety about wanting to make sure that we were going in the right direction. And he definitely saw gayness as going in the wrong direction. So we butted heads a lot. And my leaving at 16 was largely due to my knowing that I would never be accepted by him. And so I needed to forge my own path, and I did. I am somebody who is fundamentally optimistic, and continued to work with my father. I mean, my father was also a bit of a rageaholic. And so, he'd yell and blah, blah, blah. And so I learned really early how to sort of de-escalate a situation and to calmly address a situation. And so when my father, it was conceptual until I got into a relationship. And then once I was in a relationship, then all of a sudden it was like, wait, he really is gay. And so, but I was one who, and actually my sister Leslie here said to me when my father died, and I was with my father when he died, she said, I think Dad respected you most of all because you were unwilling to not be who you are. And over the years, I battled with my dad. I talked with my dad. I went to therapy with my dad. And ultimately, I came to a place of forgiveness because I realized that he did the best that he could under the circumstances that he was in. And it wasn't his fault. And fundamentally, what wound up happening, which was just amazing, is that he came and my ex and I bought a house, and he came and stayed with us twice, which was huge. And so, he fundamentally shifted toward the end of his life and began to embrace, and he was still embarrassed, right? My mother was marching in gay pride events, and my father was like, no. But he fundamentally loved me, and he would ask about my partner. And the saddest thing for me is that he did not get to meet his grandchildren. He would have loved them. And I actually think that my older son in particular was I was not the son that he wanted. It was the son that he got. And I'm okay with it. I'm not, there's no victimization there. It's just like, that's just the way it was, right? But my older son was into football and basketball and everything else, and my dad would have just loved him. So I think that, at the end of the day, it is about forgiveness. I think, one of the quotes that I really like is, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I think that I've learned in my life that holding on to those resentments, I want to meet people where they are and understand who they are, but not, and so ultimately there was forgiveness and there was reconciliation. And I was with him when he died. And I remember Leslie, actually, when Leslie had gone out, my dad was in Cedars-Sinai Hospital, and she went out to go get a snack, and she came back and she goes, "How is he?" And I had like tears in my eyes and tears were rolling down my cheek. And I said, "Not so good." So she leaves the room again, and my dad turns to me, and he's like sick, right? And he goes, "Boy, I saw that. You got to be strong for your sisters." And I'm like, "Really, dude, on your deathbed? We're going to go do that?" I'm like, okay. So at the very end, he was who he was.
I have a question. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Leslie's been talking about you for years. This is nice to finally meet you. I hear you talking a lot about the exhaustion of all these different intersections of being Black and being gay and for your boys. What do you think alleviates that? What helps you carry through, and what would you like to see become? What's a vision?
That's
support.
Interesting. I'm going to take a moment to think about that. I think part of what I would like to see is people educate themselves. And I think what's hard about that is that it really does require interaction for people to understand others. And so I can't go as far to say that I don't want to be in the position of educating, right? But I guess part of what would be nice is if people spent more time, even in forums like this, really trying to understand the experience of others, even though it's not your personal experience. And I think so for me, it would look like that. It would look like these conversations. It would look like white folks having conversations with white people, and straight people having conversations with straight people, and et cetera, so that people were really engaged in trying to understand and trying to maybe unlearn some of the things that we've all learned about one another. And I will say that, in the Black community, there's shade discrimination. The lighter you are, the better. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that this plays out. And just some compassion and empathy and a willingness to listen, I think, is helpful, because that can help to shift things. I also think that being out of your comfort zone, I think, is important, right? I mean, there are ways in which we are very comfortable. I can be very comfortable in a Black setting or a gay setting, whatever the case is. I could be in a different setting and be a little bit less comfortable. So putting myself in situations where I am less comfortable and I am other, in a sense, is also good, because it gives me understanding and empathy for what it feels like to be other. So at the end of the day, what I hope actually comes out of the conversations that we're having around race and in this country, and that is inclusive of a lot of different things, right? I mean, it includes sexual orientation, includes a lot of things, but in this case, it's race. I hope, I don't believe that legislation can get us so far, but ultimately, we know that we have legislation that protects gay people, that protects people of color, that protects women, and there's still misogyny, and there's still racism, and there's still homophobia, right? And it's because my dad used to say that racism was irrational because it was emotional. And he said, and people try to deal with racism in a rational way, but it's not rational. It's a feeling. It's an intense feeling that someone has. And so I'm just hoping that that in addition to changing something systemically, that we are that people's attitudes and beliefs can shift a little bit, so that we can just live in a kinder and gentler world. And I realize it sounds a little bit Pollyanna, but I don't know. I don't know how to shift it other than people getting to know people. I will give you a quick example. My older son was in a foster home for the first 10 months of his life, and the foster mother was an Black woman, and very religious, Pentecostal, gay people are bad, blah, blah, blah. And when she learned that 2 gay men wanted to adopt Zach, who was the boy who she had been caring for the first 10 months of his life, she was not having it. Now, what a lot of foster parents would do is they would then say, I want to adopt the child, which would then slow down everything, and then the adoptive parent would eventually leave. She chose not to do that, and she prayed on it, and she was like, you know what? I wanted Zachary to have a daddy, but not 2 daddies. And so it was like, she was very upset about it. But over time, there was learning on both sides. I did not have a lot of, I did not feel comfortable with fundamentalist Christians, right? Because of attitudes and beliefs about homosexuality. And by the end of the first year, she gave us a card and said, to the best 2 fathers I've ever known. And I shifted in my concept of what a fundamentalist Christian was. And we both came to the middle out of love for this little boy. And by the end of the day, she actually left her church because she wanted to go to a church that didn't preach that gay people were bad, because her experience was different. And I had a very different experience of fundamentalist Christians and what my concept of that was. And I had a lot more empathy and understanding and love, right? So here was an instance of people coming together around a child, and our world's completely changing as a result of that relationship. And so I just think that more relationships, in part, more relationships, will help us understand one another more, and to heal some of the deep wounds that we have in this country. I hope that answered your question. That was a little long.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
In a related field, then how do we deal with the cancellation culture that is so adamant in discarding people that think wrongly?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, honestly. I think that, it's funny. People, with the technology that we have now, people are constantly posting things. They're canceling people. And the problem with that is there's not an interaction. It's basically, sort of throwing something at someone and then closing the door. And I don't think that's good. From my perspective, if somebody says to me, gay people, Black people, women, folks who are older, whatever it is, that they are terrible and that is just how it is, typically for people like that who are very fixed in their mindset and have no interest in changing, I think it's harder to permeate that. I think if somebody says, I've been taught my whole life a bit X about gay people, or Y about Black people, or Z about women, and I still believe those things, but I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. There is an opening to actually have a conversation and to learn, right? And so I think the cancel culture is one that is the exact opposite of that. And I think one of the things that I do is when I see the cancel culture start on social media, I will often interject something different. And so I can't change that somebody else wants to shut someone else out or cancel someone else. But what I can do is I can lend my own voice to that and say, you know, actually this person doesn't deserve to be shut out. I'd actually be interested in, you know, let's have a conversation about this, right? Because I think that's where change happens. And so, so I agree, it's a problem, and it is the antithesis of connection and getting to know one another. And so I don't know how to solve it other than doing the opposite on social media and hoping that that makes some difference. And if we all did the opposite, then there wouldn't be any more cancel culture.
I was just going to say, you know, I'm just going to say too that I think sometimes there's a desire to cancel people, you know, in part because there's pain
Yes.
there, you know? So you're like, oh, you just hurt my feelings again. Like, you're out of here, right? And so part of it is for those of us who can kind of be resilient to have some of those conversations, which can be painful sometimes to hear, you know? And so not some people can't handle those conversations and some people can, you know? Like, I personally feel like usually I can do it, you know, but there's times when I'm exhausted and I'm like, I can't do it anymore. I need a break, you know? So it's interesting.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, look, I think that we all have our limits, right? And there are moments when somebody hits a chord and it's painful. But what we tend not to do is say, you know, we tend not to show our pain. What we tend to do is we show anger.
Right.
And the anger then pushes like this. And so, and when you display anger, what the other person does is immediately you get defensiveness, right? And so what would be, I think, helpful, and I know it's hard to do because nobody wants to feel vulnerable, but what would be helpful, I think, is for people to more express their vulnerability and say, you know, that actually feels really terrible to me, and here's why, and I can't have this conversation with you right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
I agree.
so at least that it's not this meeting it with aggression, but it's more like meeting it with your humanity. And you don't have to engage in the conversation, but by expressing the way that you experience that as a human being, might, even if you don't have the conversation, that expression might in itself create a slight shift in that person because they recognize that it was. Now, some people are just sociopaths, right? And so you can say that and they're just going to be like, you know, good, I'm glad I hurt you, right? So I mean, you gotta, you know, you gotta be careful, right? But most people, I think, can hear humanity, and sometimes people are just defended, like especially around like LGBTQ stuff. Like sometimes people are struggling with their sexual orientation, and so they're lashing out in a way because they're afraid of being seen in a particular way. And sometimes meeting that with kindness, even if you don't want to engage, is can be really meaningful. And I realize we can't all always do it. We're all human beings. Sometimes we get mad. Sometimes we want to talk about it. I mean, so I don't want to. I'm not trying to be overly, you know, again, optimistic or Pollyanna, but I do think that we certainly could serve to treat one another significantly better, even in the face of people doing things that are hurtful.
I have a question. Like, have you seen improvement in this is Felicity talking. I'm sorry, my internet is really low. So
okay. Oh, that's great.
Video
okay.
off. I'm sorry.
I was looking. I was like, wait, where?
Where did it come from? Here, I can maybe put it on for a minute. It goes kind of crazy. But my question is, you know, I know you have a new. If you're in San Francisco proper, I know you have a new DA and all of that. So have you seen changes in the kind of racist attitude of the police? I know it's probably too soon to see anything, but have you seen changes as far as your son's, you know, experience with police and with being stopped and all of that? I hope so, but.
Not yet, but there's a lot of conversation about it, and there's a lot of conversation about shifting it. And there's also a new DA in Walnut Creek for Contra Costa County, and she is. People are now running on addressing juvenile behaviors differently, and so I do think that we will, in the next couple of years, see a shift in this. My younger son was with a friend of his at a local school that was 3 blocks from our house, and he was with his friend, and they were doing music videos, right? They were just, they're like dancing and blah 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 blah, and they were filming themselves, and then they were going to post it on YouTube. And cops drove up, and they said, "What are you doing?" And both boys were black, and he said, my son said, "Well, we're doing music videos." And the cop's like, "Yeah, right." And thank God his friend had his phone out already. He goes, "No, really, look." And so he shows them the video, and the cops start laughing. And they're like, okay, guys, I'm sorry. You know what? We got 2 calls saying that there were 2 black men who looked suspicious, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, they're boys, but whatever. And he said, "But I can see that you guys are just out having fun. Please don't be mad. Enjoy your day. And keep doing what you're doing," right? So there are moments like that too, where their humanity was seen, and innocent, like, "No, but look, really," you know what I mean? And they're kind of like, wow. But I mean, there are moments where the cops are really. I used to run the city of Berkeley, and I can say that I had a police department there in which I supervised, and there are a lot of good cops out there. And what people, I think, forget is that Black people call the police too. And police do protect Black folks too. And so I think that training needs to be really different with police departments. And I think that part of the folks who are coming into offices now, that we're going to see those changes happen. But I also think that, I know that there's a lot of talk about defunding the police, and I know what that really means is taking some money from the police and putting it towards social services. Right. But I think we've expected cops to do a lot of things that they have no idea what they're doing. But yeah, I also think that there are good cops as well, and so we need to train police officers to be better human beings around this stuff. And I also understand that cops are in life and death situations all the time, and they're human beings as well, and they get scared too. But I think the problem is the racial predictability of that is a problem, and that is what needs to stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to say something too, like what you said, how Dad said that racism is not rational, that it's emotional. And I just remember doing in college, like, we all wrote down a particular ethnicity or a particular racial group, and we wrote down characteristics of each one. And it was amazing, all the stuff that came out about each group that was just in us. It's just in our minds, in our hearts, and disturbing. And so, I'm wondering if even police officers, or just in general, all of us can kind of do training where we're, let's say we see a Black person, or we see an Asian person, or we see and just kind of pay attention to what's happening in our bodies and in our minds, and kind of go, what is that? Where does that come from? And how can I be aware of that? And so when you think about cops, like, reacting just like in the moment, in the heat of the moment, and they're just responding to that inbuilt bias that's in there. It's like, which we all have, in many ways. It's kind of like, how do we get to the root of that? And I think some of that is sort of exercises, unconscious exercises of looking at how does race sit with all of us inside emotionally,
Well, I just wanted to add, because one time I got invited to a diversity training for the sheriff's department for new cadets, with sheriff and also some police cadets. And it was a very short training. I mean, I wish it had been many more hours and days than just like a 6-hour training on diversity. But the way they did it in the morning, they divided all of the cadets into groups, and they had this butcher paper on the wall in 6 different groups. And one of them was for gay and trans, LGBTQ. One was for Latinos. One was actually trans was a different one. So it was LGB, trans, Latinos, Muslims, Blacks. I think that was it. And I think they also, because they had a sick woman there too. So, you know, different Middle Eastern. And so in the morning, what they had was have each of them had a different color marker, and they'd write down the first things that came to their mind. Like for, you know, Black, good dancer, drug dealer, whatever. So they wrote, and they were trying to be honest. And then in the afternoon, they had a representative of each group stand at their paper. And then the groups would rotate around and they would talk about what their prejudices or initial thoughts were. And this person would say, you know, well, some of us, you know, are great athletes and some of us are terrible athletes. And it was really, I mean, I like the idea. I just wish it had been a larger part of their 6 months training, you know?
Yes.
I think it would be, I love that. And I think it would be great to be able to do that in schools, honestly. I mean, there were so, you know, Beverly Tatum wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she talks a lot about racial identity development. And I think that she talks about racism as being like smog, right? That you just breathe it in just by being in this culture. And I do think that we all have ideas and thoughts about people who we don't have a lot of experience with, or whatever, or we only have a very limited experience with, right? Maybe you were robbed by somebody who was Latino, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, and that's my experience, right? So it's interesting, and I love that. I think it would be great if we could do that more and earlier.
Yeah.
I had a comment. Thank you so much, William, for doing this and sharing all your insights with us. I'd say, coming from my life experience, the things I was really impressed with was that you were strong enough to leave home, when you're having issues with your father and the things he said, your internal voice said, well, I'll show you. I really admire that strength. And so what it leads me to is probably a question that you and Leslie have to answer together, but the whole nature and nurture thing. Do you perceive that you've always been the sort of person that just knows what you want and will stand up for it? Or was there something in your home environment that encouraged people to speak for themselves and to say what they think and to act out on their beliefs?
That's a great question. Les, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I do think that because our parents kind of had sort of a civil rights vibe, you know, that we talked about a lot. I mean, our family, you know, around Black people especially, right? And women. But so I feel like we were encouraged to kind of debate and like speak up on some level if Dad wasn't like super mad.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Look, I think, you know, I wonder sometimes, it's a great question. And I wonder sometimes, like, I wonder why I have such a container for emotional and psychological stuff. And, you know, I think the real answer is I don't know. And maybe it was just, I'm hardwired that way. But I do think I got a lot of practice with my dad, who was my dad was just very strong and very domineering. And so I had to learn how to navigate that. And my mother was the opposite. My mother was very strong, but quietly so. And so I think from both of them, I learned, from my father, I learned how to deal with conflict and sort of this combative thing. And from my mother, I learned how to stand in my center strongly and not move, right? To be resolute in my beliefs. And so I watched my mother do that. I watched my father do his thing. And I think somehow the combination of that, that with my hardwiring, somehow made it work. And so I feel very fortunate to be the guy who, in a crisis, am very calm and focused and move through it. And then I have to process it later, but I'm able to compartmentalize in that moment and make it happen. And I think when I was 16, I compartmentalized. I said, okay, you know what? I got to put this aside now because this is about my emotional and psychological life. And I do not want, I can't have that be destroyed. So where that I will not have that destroyed comes from, that's my armchair psychological assessment of the nurture part of it. And then the hardwiring, I have no idea. But it's a really good question, and a question that I often wonder about.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, I have to call you back. I have to call you back.
How are your sons in this time with everything that's been going on, especially the last few months? How are they understanding it? How are they dealing with it? How are they responding to it?
They're struggling. They're afraid. They are, my older son was just diagnosed with type 2 bipolar disorder. And he could sometimes get very upset about things. And, you know, and he's now being treated for that, and that's great. And so that's been really helpful. But, you know, he just would say to me, you know, I'm so afraid that, like, there's going to be an episode in public and somebody's going to call the police and I'm going to get killed. My kids get afraid of driving, right? They're afraid of, you know, the story that I told you about my son, when the two cops came up and said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, we're doing music videos. My younger son said, oh my God, I was so relieved when they drove up and they were Asian, you know, because he was just like, if they'd been white cops somehow, it would have triggered him and the fear in him. So I think they're struggling, and I do everything I can to help them process it in a way that is both, because, you know, I need them to protect themselves too, right? It's like, I remember when my older son, he was so mad. He was like, why do I have to put my hands on the steering wheel? Why do I have to say yes or no, sir? Why do I have to? And I said, because you do. And it's not fair and it's not right, but it is the reality that we live in right now. And I need you to be alive. So this is what you're going to do. So there's a way in which I push them to accept the reality in that moment, but outside of that moment to fight for change, right? Because in that moment, they're vulnerable. Outside of that moment, their voice is more likely to be heard. And so helping them navigate that is complicated, but they're young still, right? And so they're still thinking about, they're grappling with it right now. And I'm glad that they trust me enough to be the person that they can go to have the conversation. Yeah, so they're grappling with it, but managing. Yeah. It's hard to be seen, right? It's hard to be seen as undesirable, as a threat, as, you know, and then it's hard to feel like your life is at risk. And then, you know, you have all the YouTube videos of like people saying terrible things and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it just feels like a barrage. And I just have to remind them that there are a lot of people in the world who are not like that. And so, you know, I would say to my kids, you know, a black person will cut you as quick as a white person will cut you. So what you got to do is you got to find the people, no matter the race, the people who are good people who are not going to cut you, right? Because that's really the name of the game, because there's good and bad people in every race. So
right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. It's hard for kids to get that, you know. It takes them a while, I think.
I mean, it takes all of us, right?
All of us a while.
We're all learning, we're all figuring out, we're all growing up in different periods of time and different things are happening. And, you know, it's complicated. And what what I know is that raising my blood pressure around these things and holding onto a lot of anger is not healthy for me. So what I do is I recognize what's true, and I do everything that I can to address the issues at hand, and to be emotionally available and emotionally responsive and emotionally intelligent. But, you know, if I let every single thing that, you know, around race and around sexual orientation and around all of that, if I let that in a profound way, you know, I mean, most of us, if we let those things in, wouldn't be able to get up out of bed every morning, right? And so at some point, you learn how to be resilient, you learn how to dust yourself off, and you learn how to say, you know what, this is the reality, this is what I'm gonna work on changing, and I'm gonna do that part. And if everybody did that, we would actually be in a really different place in this culture. And so I'm hopeful that, you know, we have, that we can lead with that over the next few years in this country. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So does anyone else have any more questions? I think we're good.
I love Zoom. Zoom is like, does anybody have any questions? And then you don't know somebody trying to unmute or like.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's. I think we're good. I think everybody's.
I'd just like to say that once, you know, people can travel again, I would think, I mean, I think we all would just be so overjoyed if you come down and visit us here at IUCC.
I would love that.
We would love it too.
William, that would be awesome if you could come. Once this whole pandemic is out, I really would love for you to come and visit us.
I would honestly, I would love that. And Leslie has told me such amazing things about this church and about you guys on this committee, and how included and how wonderful she feels, and how wonderful she feels about being able to raise Ava in this environment. And so I have a very warm feeling in my heart for all of you, and I would love to have that visit.
I was so much looking forward to hearing your story today. I was very touched. Thank you so much, William. It was awesome. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a really great rest of your weekend, and thank you so much for including me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you,
William.
Thank you.
We love you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Wow, great.
Leslie, your brother was awesome. Thank you so much.
Isn't he just wonderful? He's so sweet. I love him.
Yeah, let's hope the pandemic is over soon so we can have him over.
Yes.
You can tell your siblings, Leslie, just wonderful people. Thank you so much.
Leslie, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I hope you guys all have a great weekend.
Yes. Okay, you guys, thank you. And we'll talk soon.
We'll talk tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.